You're listening to the Breakaway Wealth Podcast, the show that helps you build wealth faster, think outside the box, and break out of the herd. Here's your host, Jim Oliver. Welcome back, Breakaway Wealth. I'm your host, Jim Oliver, and with me today, my special guest, Doug Lynam. Welcome, Doug.
Thanks, Jim. Honored to be here.
Hey, I can't wait for this because I guarantee you I have never interviewed somebody with your background before. So we got that going for us, and this is going to be fun. So audience, as we get started, I'm going to have Doug introduce himself, and then I got lots of questions.
Great. Well, yeah, my backstory is wild and it could take the whole interview. So I'll just give you the highlights and then you can kind of dig deeper into it. Quick backstory. I grew up in a relatively affluent family. My dad was an executive for an oil company and it was divorced and all kinds of things. And money was kind of from my childhood experience, which was limited, it felt like money was weaponized. And if I asked my dad for something, he'd say, ask your mom. She's got all my money. Ask your mom. You say, dad's got all the money. And you kind of get stuck in between. And so I kind of mistakenly believed, I could summarize my journey with two quotes. The first part of my journey was believing St. Paul when he said that the money is the root of all evil. And now I'm more in the Mark Twain camp where he humorously said that the lack of money is the root of all evil. So that kind of gives you the bookends for my journey. But then I went off to college, studied philosophy, mathematics, got a little tired of that kind of heady world, joined the Marine Corps. I went to officer candidate school with the Marines. I graduated at the top of my class and then decided that high explosives and unresolved anger issues were not a good combination. I then had a bit of a spiritual awakening and was looking for something else that would give me the structure and meaning and purpose that I so much enjoyed about the Marine Corps, and ran off and joined a Benedictine monastery for 20 years. So I took a vow of poverty, lived all that, and it caused a lot. What I saw in the monastery was the chaos that poverty really causes. And early on in the monasteries, in my journey, when 3 years after I got there, and I was there 20 years, the monastery went bankrupt and there was all these unresolved money issues. It turns out we took the vow of poverty a little too seriously. And all of us were just really what I would call avoidant around money. So my new book is called Taming Your Money Monster, 9 Paths to Financial Mastery with the Enneagram, but we can get to that later. But what I was noticing, that the seeds for this book really were planted there when I was like, why are these smart, bright, intelligent, capable people with advanced degrees unable to, well, all of us, myself included, especially, I'm pointing the finger at me. Why couldn't we get our act together around this financial stuff? So that planted a seed. Fast forward, I was also in a teaching order. So I was the head of a mathematics department at a prestigious private school while I was in the monastery. I kind of burnt out in the monastic thing in 2017. Went into finance. So there's a whole pivot there. My first book is called From Monk to Money Manager, which there's a whole huge story about how that happened. But essentially, I started building better retirement plans. I found that when I was a teacher that our retirement plan for our school sucked, and they basically sucked across the board in every school I could look at. And then I realized it was a national problem. So I realized, hey, this is an opportunity for me to transition into a new career and solve a pain point for people financially. That went really well. I got featured in the New York Times. All this cool stuff happened. I got a 2-book deal from HarperCollins, which is what we're talking about today, hopefully. And then I exited from that business in last summer, and now I'm a full-time writer, speaker, and coach.
That's awesome. I think this interview could be 3 hours long, so I'm trying to decide which things to focus on. All right, so first we got to go back. I've never been Catholic. I dated a Catholic girl in high school and in college. I ended up marrying the one from college. That was my first marriage. I have to say, I can't say my ex-wife because I have 2 of those now, but she went to Benedictine college in Atchison, Kansas. So, I don't think I ever was introduced to anybody in the monastery there, but, so I think about that and I think about, let me back up, because you talked about money being weaponized in your house, right? And you grew up affluently. I grew up very poor and money felt weaponized to me, other people's money, and how they looked at me not having it. So I always say that, we all have our burdens to carry, and adversity introduces a man to himself. And there's lots of different kinds of adversity. And you had this adversity that was different, which drove you to want to learn about money. I had this thing to drive me to learn about money, but it was coming from a different place. And so I think that's really cool and you were obviously a way better student than me. So I'm looking at these things and I'm thinking that's really interesting and cool. We ended up in the same place trying to build a clientele and assets under management and all this stuff. But we came to it from a very different place. So as you know, and then thinking about, I don't think anybody who's never been a monk could ever think about that. And then I didn't even think about, I've worked with like the Catholic diocese and a Catholic diocese in Iowa. And so I kind of understand a little bit about like that part of the economics and financial world for the Catholic Church. And there's and then the Enneagram is all thrown in there. Okay. So then I'm going to start with going from being a Marine Corps officer candidate, top of your class. So obviously you're overachiever. And so I'm going to guess that your Enneagram is 3, but
nailed it.
Yeah.
Nailed it.
So I'm 96.58 and 96.53. So my Enneagram coach tells me that's unusual, but and then I think 7 is like over 90%. So anybody that does, let's start there. What about like talk about the Enneagram for people, just like maybe just a really quick overview for people that don't know what Enneagram is, and then like how your Enneagram, and going back to your book, how it reveals what you're, because again, what I'm saying is we both had money monsters, but they were different, right? So I'm tying all that back to the book because then I want to hear about the book because I get that money monster that you're talking about.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Because mine was scarcity, yours was manipulation, kind of, right? So go ahead.
Okay, so it's a big question. So let's try to give your readers a quick primer on the Enneagram. And it's a vastly complicated topic, and it's, so we're only going to scratch the surface. And one way to think about the Enneagram is that it's like a fractal. If you know what a fractal is, it's got infinite variety inside of a firm structure. So the Enneagram is sort of the rules of human consciousness. How there's only so, I like to use car metaphors because I think they're easy for people to grasp. If you think of your ego as a type of car, there's only so many, what you drive is a unique make, model, year, yours is unique, yet there's only so many ways you can design a car and have it be roadworthy. And there's only so many ways you can design a human ego consciousness and have it function properly. And so the Enneagram tells us what are the basic, so in our personality, there's a debate between nature and nurture. And so we have the nature part as our DNA, but the nurture part, I believe, is where the Enneagram comes in. That kind of determines your type is primarily, and this has been one of the key things I've been doing with the book, why I think it's kind of a breakthrough book, is that historically the Enneagram has kind of been a little bit in the woo-woo space. And as someone whose background is in math and science, I'm like, okay, it works, but why? So what I've really tried to do is what's the why behind it? Why does it work? How does it work? Grounding it in neurobiology, grounding it in childhood developmental psychology. And so anyway, but the basically think of your Enneagram type as your ego defense mechanisms that you developed in childhood to handle the biggest stressors in your environment. And your reaction to those stressors, there's really 9 sort of archetypal ways that we can react to those traumas, because all of them are going to run off of the limbic system of the brain. There's only 3 primary negative emotions in the mammalian brain, and they are anger, fear, and sadness. And so which of those 3, think of your Enneagram type almost like a hex code. What's the color combination of those 3 negative emotions? But one of them you got hit with more than the other, and that lands you in we call the triad. So think of the Enneagram like a pie, or like a pizza pie or whatever. And if you cut it into 9 slices, then there's sort of 9, where you fall on that color wheel is going to really what your type is. And so there's 9 types because we've got these 3 negative emotions: anger, fear, and sadness. You got hit with one more than the other. And then you can either internalize that pain, kind of like giving yourself an emotional wedgie. You can externalize it and project it out on the world, or you can have both. And so that's why there's 9 types. And your type 9, or let's say you kind of feel like an 8 to me, but it's too early to say. But if you were an 8, then the coolest part about the Enneagram is it tells you what your deepest unconscious fear is. And then the flip side of that is your greatest hope. Like what's this unconscious driver that's motivating you in most of your interactions in life? And so if you're an 8, Your greatest fear is being harmed and controlled. So you're always pushing against reality, the boundaries, to maintain control, to maintain your sense of autonomy. And you really hate anything that's gonna impede on you. I don't know if that resonates more with you than the 3. So you're in the anger triad. You have you've taken this anger and you've externalized it. You're pushing it out against the world and pushing against the limitations and boundaries of reality. And you have tremendous superpowers for that. For me, and we don't need to go through all the 9 types, but let's just play with the 2 of ours because it's fun. And I'm a type 3, and so I'm in we call the sadness or shame triad. And so I have this internalized. The sadness is like a sadness about or grief around how you perceive yourself or how you think others perceive you. So my deepest unconscious pain is this internalized sadness about how I perceive myself, and then this grief or shame about that, but also a grief and shame about how I think others perceive me. And that creates my greatest fear of being worthless. So I'm always gunning for the next achievement, like look at me, and always have an endless to-do list, running around trying to achieve things to assuage that inner pain. So that gives you just those 2 types kind of give you a sense of how the Enneagram works.
Yeah. So you know what? I looked it up while you were speaking. I'm a 99.68 and a 99.53 and a what was the other one?
7?
And then 71% 7. So like my little triangle thing, it has like this little hook right there. But that totally nails it, because when you like, I think, I grew up in foster care, and then I was adopted into a really abusive home, and we were very poor, and we were homeless for a while. And so it's like this, I think that the 8, you're right. I mean, that nails it. I actually have, the book, the 8 journal. It's, I don't know, I'm sure there's a few of them out there, but there's the one that I have from the lady. It brings it back to spirituality and scripture and stuff too. So it's cool. I really think it's really valuable. My ex-wife, who's a great friend of mine, she is a 9. And so it totally explains why she's my ex-wife.
So I have a heuristic, a quick rule of thumb for this. Good. It's anecdotal. It's not scientific. I can't prove it yet. But my theory is this: don't date your wings. So don't date the numbers next to you on the Enneagram, because you're going to try to be attracted to each other because opposites attract. Yeah. So the 8's always challenging, looking to almost create conflict in a way. The 9's always looking to avoid conflict. That's their greatest fear. Your unconscious wounds are just going to trigger the bejesus out of each other. Yeah. And I had the same thing with my ex-wife. She was a type 2 and I'm a type 3. And I did figure this out. Like, oh my gosh, we are totally unsuited for each other.
So, what's funny about when you say that is then you say to yourself, when you don't understand what you just said, you say, gosh, we're just in this cycle, right? By the way, I have those exact same coffee cups.
Nice.
It's at mine, or from my golf club up in Louisville, Kentucky. You would say, well, and I even said this to her, because again, we're friends and I love her, is I trigger you, then you trigger me, then I trigger you, then you trigger me. And we can't figure out why we can't get off of this, hamster wheel. And it's just like over and over again. So like, I like what you say about sacred wounds, because, I just did a talk a few months ago for our community about like our false beliefs. So are sacred wounds kind of like false beliefs? Because, I know our false beliefs motivate our financial behaviors, and most people are insecure about money. So they hoard it or save it, and they don't put it to work as much as probably they should. So talk about those wounds and, not only what they are or how we get them, but how do we start to heal them?
Oh, those are big questions. So let's start with the sacred wound. Let's tie it back to the money, and then we'll see if we can figure out how to heal it. So the sacred wound, the way I think of it is like this: when imagine this is sort of a thought experiment. Imagine you're in the womb, in your ego, for your consciousness first flickers on. What would that experience be like? And my hypothesis is that you would be in a state of unconscious unity with your environment, meaning you don't have a clear sense of what's me and what's not me. So there's no real ego boundary you've developed yet. And then you get popped out, and boom, you welcome to the world. And then you have this physical umbilical cord that gets severed between you and your mother, but there's a psychological umbilical cord that gets developed between you and your caregivers. And that's necessary to help you drive. Basically, your caregivers are doing most of the driving for your ego and for your life for the first few years. But that egoic codependence has to be severed. And that's what I call your sacred wound. And so that egoic codependence can only be severed by negative emotions, because positive emotions would reinforce your connections to your caregivers. And we know from the affective neuroscience work of Jaak Panksepp that the three biggest emotions, which are negative emotions, which I mentioned earlier, call them the big three. That's anger, fear, and sadness. And so one of those did most of the cutting, and that creates your greatest fear for your Enneagram type. And that sets this whole chain of emotion. There's a whole chain of causal things that come about from that greatest fear. We have ego addictions. We each have two. We have, our worst vice, which comes up. And then there's a whole, I call it your shadow structure. So basically I took a very Jungian concept and built out and really laid out mathematically what the shadow structure is in a really clear linear format for the reader. And then the inverse of that is your enlightenment structure. How do you traverse from that path? What I call your false self would be your shadow structure. And then your true self would be more your enlightenment or awakening structure. And that's really what the book is getting into the weeds on. So that's a quick explanation of the sacred wound. And then for the money issue, this is where it gets interesting. If, again, we've got 9 archetypal personality patterns in the Enneagram, and I've layered on top of that what I call the attachment theory of money, which is based on the attachment theory of relationships. So it's basically the same idea if you're familiar with it, just with a different application. But the concept is that when we relate to money in unhealthy ways, we have two primary, these are your money monsters. You can be either anxiously attached to money or fearfully avoidant of it. And so that gives you 2 money monsters for each type. And we tend to lean towards one or the other, but we also can be both depending on the aspect of our financial life. So if I call them the 4 pillars of finance. And the 4 pillars of finance are earning, saving, investing, and giving. And so you could be anxious in one area and avoidant in another, or you can switch it up depending on your mood and time of day. But as someone who falls into the avoidant, you probably fell into the anxious camp, and I fell into the avoidant camp. And so we both had to do our work to try to come to some healthy relationship to money at the end. Okay, so those are the first 2 questions. You can interrupt there, or do you want to go into the healing process?
Let's talk about that for a second, because I like the way that attachment was explained to me, is you're a infant and you're at the park and a train comes by and it makes this loud noise and shakes the ground. And if you have a normal attachment, you turn around, look for your mother, and the mother assures you everything's fine. And then if you have is there a chaotic?
One? Yeah, call it the jumbled style, chaotic.
So then you don't know what, you don't look for somebody to comfort you. I think that's the camp that I'm in. So I think you're right. When I think about money, people look at me and they go, well, you have bought or started or, whatever 30 companies, and well, aren't you worried about this or this? And it's no, because I'm not seeking comfort because I don't think I ever had it. So to me, comfort sedates you, and other people, that's what they really want. Right. And that's not the thing that drives me. So I think that's really cool what you just said. Now let's go to the healing thing. Okay.
All right. Well, that's a big process. And again, lay
and
it
you
all
can
out.
comment on that if you want, and then we can go to the.
So just to circle back to something you said earlier, it's really common in the foster system for kids to be type 8s more than, and type 6s and 8s tend to show up more among people who are in the foster system. So that's a thing. At any rate, just FYI. And you tend to be one type. So you might score high on, you might have what we call tri-type. You have one that's dominant, and then you have others that can be secondary and tertiary. But there's one, and I suspect you're predominantly an 8, maybe an 8 with a 7 wing. So we call
7.
that.
Yeah, it's funny. Yeah, because it has the 7 wing.
Right.
And when my the person that introduced me to this started talking about the 3, it really wasn't me, because even though I score high in a lot of those areas, it's really, I don't relate to it because I wasn't the top of my class in anything.
Right.
And I, other than I wanted to join the Navy, but I had a juvenile record.
Here's the quick test. Do you give a too much about what other people think about you?
No, not at all.
Then you're not a 3. So 3s are the ultimate people pleasers. We are hyper empathic in some ways. And a 3 is someone who walks into a room and instantly changes their persona, changes how they present themselves to match what they think is going to impress the person in front of them. And
my friends in my neighborhood would say, like, I'm the guy in the neighborhood that they're always like, I don't care what the rules are. I don't care what anybody else thinks of me. I don't care what you think I'm wearing. I don't care what car you think I'm driving or what my house looks like.
Right.
I don't give a shit about any of that.
That's the opposite. So the thing is that the 8 and the 3 share a lot of traits because we're both extroverts.
Yeah.
We're both what we call the assertive types, meaning we're out there fighting for what we want. And so there's going to be a lot of overlap between those two types in how they present. But the core motivation is radically different.
Yeah. You know what? The 3 and the 8 thing, thank you for that clears up for me 100%. Like wondering about those 2 scores being so high and everything else and being a little bit confused on that totally clarifies that for me.
Great.
So I love something about the way that you do something is you do make things, you were talking about just some things. I don't even know what the heck you were talking about earlier when you were talking about how to figure out some of the theory, but you make it very clear and understandable. So I can see why you're a great coach. And in the 20 years of being, again, I don't know anything about being a monk, but I can imagine there's one thing that I have a hard time with and it's like it says in the Bible, be still. Right. And I would imagine for some reason, I think as a monk, you have to learn how to be still. So then when you're dealing with money, I think you have to know when to be still with money too. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Like sometimes doing nothing is the best thing you can do, particularly
like right now.
Yeah.
Like what the market, the tariffs are going to do this and the market's going down. Like just stop.
Right. Hopefully you have your plan should be an all-weather plan that isn't based on the news cycle because that will cause you to start trading and that just makes the traders rich and Wall Street rich and makes you poor. That's the best way to lose your money. Yeah,
the people that panic are always the ones that lose and they're counting on that. Like you just said, I try to tell people that too. When I was doing financial planning like that and I was building my clientele, so to speak, and I don't even know why I'm saying this, but one of the books that this is a textbook, okay, maybe the only textbook that I've ever read, is it's by Tom Stanley, and it's Selling to the Affluent, and it's the Professional's Guide to. It's his textbook that he based The Millionaire Next Door on.
Oh, right.
And he wrote 2 textbooks about this that are like 500 pages each in real detail. Then he took that and made it a 150, 200 page bestseller, right? Mm-hmm. He actually passed away. I just found out. I don't know how long ago he passed away, but I love the Enneagram thing because to me, like I'm trying to figure out like what's God's purpose for my experience and what's God's purpose for my life. And the Enneagram helps me understand when I'm being healthy and when I'm not being healthy.
Right.
And I can be too risk, like I'm really not a risky person, but I can get myself to that point where I'm like, I can do it all, Yeah. And so talk about how does all of your experiences tie into, and how do you work with somebody? Like if somebody says, what is this Enneagram? What's Doug talking about? What's Jim talking about?
Right.
Like, where do you start with somebody? Like if somebody's listening to this and they say, I want to find out more about this. How do they find out what you do and how you help people and how you serve people, Doug?
Well, sure. First of all, the book from Taming Your Money Monster, it's now available for pre-orders on Amazon. It comes out July 8th. You can go to my website, douglynam.com, to find all the cool resources and links for everything there. So that would be your first place to go if you're interested in coaching, you're interested in the books, you're interested in having me come speak. So I do keynotes. So that would be the way to get more information. And I hate to toot my own horn, but I think this book is going to be a game changer for how people think about the Enneagram, because I've really revised it from the ground up, so to make it much clearer and much simpler and much more linear rather than kind of being a little ethereal as it can sometimes be. But to your point, let me go back to your question about your divine purpose. So one of the things I do for each Enneagram type is I list so if you think of this, your audience can't see it, but I have an ego map for each of the 9 types, and it's my inverted on the camera anyway, so you can't even tell what it is. But the point is that if you go follow this ego map from your sacred wound, which we talked about earlier at the bottom, it's just, there's probably 12 steps in this process. And then you get to the top, you get to your sacred gift, which is, I think, sort of the divine community service that you are particularly called to manifest. And for an 8, I call it divine justice. Like eights tend to have a really hard time with injustice, but to get there, they have to embody their greatest virtue. So the greatest virtue for an 8 would be innocence. Is really to connect with it, to try to quell this anger and heal that inner anger that caused your sacred wound, so you can reconnect more fully with your sense of the divine and with others in a healthier way. But to get there, there's a couple steps you got to go through. So yeah, is really to bring that power, that strength, that drive you have in service of others, in service of protecting others, and whatever that means for you, like however that can, maybe it's helping, kids in the foster care system, or going back. How are you giving back in some way? And so I would say that would be for you something to be mindful of.
No, you know what? You nailed it. I mean, that's my motivation. Like, I just had somebody ask me yesterday, they like, why do you, like, because they asked me if I wanted to play golf, and I said, I'm working, I'm recording some podcasts tomorrow morning. They said, why are you still working? And I said, I'll work until the day I die. Like I love what I do. I mean, and I feel like I want to I have a goal of impacting 1 billion people. Now that could mean that, I meet you and we do something together, and that impacts this many people and this many people and this many, because I believe in leverage. Obviously, I'm not going to impact 1 billion people by myself. Through this networking, which I think is one of our most important things, how do we serve people? And that's the thing that I always ask people in a room is, how can I serve you? Right. Yeah. And so it's funny because you nailed that. I mean, you clarified something for me. So this has been super valuable for me. And I'm going to go to your website because, if you can, in 28 minutes, if we can clarify that, then I'm going to figure out how to get some one-on-one sessions with you to clarify it more, because I'm all about communication and clarity and trying to figure out the path and the things that are holding me back from the path, my brakes, my gas, so I think about that now,
let's do this because I haven't gotten to your other question of how do we heal our money trauma.
Let's do that. Yes.
And so it's too big of a question to answer in the time we have, but I could talk about your type. Okay, so maybe we could just walk through your ego structure, and we'll and so I've redesigned the Enneagram to put it into a 3D model. So I know I'm a visual learner, so audio is not my strong suit, but I'll do my best. You have to think of this a double cone, like stack two traffic cones on top of each other. And you're kind of going from the bottom where you're born, and then you kind of get to the middle point, and then in the middle point, well, that's kind of the visual imagery to think about. But if we start at the bottom, we go back to your sacred wound. You have this externalized anger at an environment that wasn't safe, that you didn't feel, and so the 8 basically takes this motto that the best defense is a good offense. So the nickname for the 8, I call him the Hummer. So you're the Humvee of ego consciousness.
Yep.
And so that creates your greatest fear. So we're kind of moving up this ladder of this double cone. That gets you to your greatest fear of being harmed or controlled. And we say your greatest vice, I call it your greatest vice. Most people think of it as your passion. I think that's an antiquated term. But the greatest vice for an 8 is lust. It's not just for sex, but it's a lust for intensity. Like you love the fight. You love being in the arena, like the ultimate gladiator, just battling it out. That's your sweet spot. But it can get you in all kinds of trouble. And so
we're not going to be able to produce this recording. You're hitting a little too close to home on all this stuff. I'm an open book, so I'm okay, audience. I'm just kidding.
Okay, so this lust is sort of it's a negative emotion in some ways. And so your ego doesn't want to look at it. So what it does is it creates what I call your primary ego addiction, traditionally called your ego fixation. But again, I'm changing all the terminology that is traditionally used for reasons for clarity and for structure and lots of other reasons. But then your primary ego addiction is vengeance. It's that desire to push back when you feel like something's controlling or harming you. So that vengeance feels good. It's almost like a dopamine hit. It feels right. It's like, got to push back. And then you have a secondary ego addiction. So when your primary ego addiction gets you in trouble, it's like there's like taking a shot of espresso when you've had a shot of tequila. It's like one's an upper, one's a downer. And so your secondary ego addiction is called stinginess, meaning you when your normal default mode of operating doesn't work, if that vengeance is getting you into trouble, and so you can't use more of it because it's causing the problems around you, then you retreat into yourself and we have what I call your ego stress response, which would be rigid withdrawal. You just pull back, get really tight, and kind of wait for the traffic to clear a little bit. Does that resonate with you?
No, that right on the money again.
All right. So now that's the bottom half of this double cone as you just went up. And then you get to the middle point, and that's what I call your dark night of the soul. That's the point where your ego addictions have created so much separation between you and the rest of reality. You feel separate from everyone and everything, including your sense of the divine, even your divine connections. And that dark night of the soul can happen through external trauma and things can happen. But typically for most people, there's sort of a midlife crisis that comes up. It's like all the things that we were doing to build up our ego fail to work. The divorces come, the job losses come, something happens. And then we get tossed into this, we overdose essentially on these ego addictions because they're our default mode and way of dealing with stress and dealing with conflict and whatever. And so we just like a puffer fish, we blow up and we push everything away. And then if we're not careful, it's sort of the maximum, that's where your ego is at its maximum inflation, so to speak. And now we can go through multiple dark nights. This isn't a one and done, but if you can break open in that space, if you can let go, if you can see how your ego addictions and your basically take responsibility for your behavior and for your life and say, this is all self-created to some extent, to a large extent, and be able to break open in that space, and it helps to have a spiritual practice of some sort in this process, then you move up into what we call the second half of life. You start to soften, you gain some wisdom, you gain more compassion, you gain more understanding and more patience. And then for you, the first thing, there is a little trap door on this process. I call it your faux virtue. And for an 8, it's the virtue that feels good, but it's actually something that you probably shouldn't be engaging in too much. And paradoxically, it's joy. So when you see an 8 having too much fun, it's like a bull in a china shop if they thought breaking things was hilarious. Like you just kind of go on this rampage and like you're having a lot of fun, indulging in that lust, indulging in all. And all right, so that's just a little sidebar. But when we get into healing your money trauma and healing your Enneagram type, the primary recovery for an 8 would be mercy. So the first thing you need to learn is to be more merciful towards the people around you, especially when they're being idiots in your mind, because you think kind of everyone's being an idiot sometimes. Maybe, I don't know about you, but I'm projecting there a little bit. So you have mercy is the primary virtue that's going to overcome that desire for vengeance. And then you have a secondary recovery virtue, which is honesty. Honesty for an 8 isn't so much about telling everyone else where they're wrong, but about being honest about that tender, gooey spot inside your soul. Like 8s are really very kind and compassionate and decent human beings, but you hide it behind this heavy armor. It's having the honesty to take the armor off and be vulnerable. And then when you do that, you combine honesty with mercy, you get to your greatest virtue, which is innocence, right? So you've got these 2 sub virtues that combine for your greatest virtue. Have I lost you yet? Am I going too fast?
No.
Okay. And then once you get to your greatest virtue of innocence, those wounds, that sacred wound starts to heal. And then you start to be able to have a healthy relationship to yourself, which then can, and I'm jumping a lot of steps here, but once you have a healthier relationship with yourself, you're going to have a healthier relationship with everything really. But the book is focusing on money. Like how do you then have a healthier relationship to your finances? And that is what will bring about your greatest hope. And for you, it's to experience complete freedom from harm and control, which doesn't mean bad things won't happen to you, but you've got this grounded internal center, your connection to the divine, that gives you a certain sort of trust and faith in the universe that you're internally free, regardless of what's happening externally in your life. And then you're able to manifest that sacred gift of divine justice. And let me just talk about if you want to ask a question about that, but I want to get to the money monsters and the money masters for the 8 really quick, if I can jump to that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so I skipped that. So on the bottom half of that cone, the 2 money monsters for the 8 are what I call the detonator and the dominator. So if you're money avoidant, 8s tend not to be so much avoid of money itself, but from the limitations it can impose upon them. So if you're money avoidant in your 8, you tend to detonate prudent financial limitations and boundaries and be too accepting of risk and like you'll grab a check at a restaurant to show people who's the boss. You want to look like the big man. And so you tend to like not follow prudent financial practices because you want to be in control and you don't want to be controlled by any financial limitations in your life. So that's one of the money monsters. And your other one, I call them the dominators. So it's that desire to weaponize money, to use money to control other people and in your circumstances, your environment. And that can get very toxic for the people around you, especially. But when you overcome them, when you move into your enlightenment structure, the top half of that double cone, I call your money master the dynamo. So you can take all that energy, all that power, all that enthusiasm, and use it for healing the crack in the world that you were designed to fix. And you're clearly on that path. So kudos to you.
I love what you just said because you said, I love that the way that you're doing, like you're breaking this down, because I'm always talking to people about mindset. Like you have to have the right mindset before you can have money, right? You started in the beginning of money's the root of all evil. It's like really the love of money is the root of all evil. When I was poor, I loved money. Mm-hmm. Now that I'm wealthy, I don't love money anymore. I don't really care, right? Like it doesn't matter. And it's because it's different, right? Like it's not this thing that's dominating my life anymore. But when you're poor, it's like you're told, hey, the reason we're sleeping in the field behind the Moose Lodge is because we don't have any money. The reason you can't have that is we don't have any money. You can't have that because you don't have any money. You're hungry because we don't have any money. So, but then when you have money, it's like, well, money isn't really the thing that I wanted, mm-hmm. right? And so what I love about this is people always saying to me, Jim, I don't know how to take action because I'm afraid, or I have this hung up, or this or this or this. And I've not had somebody who's like the go-to, partner with us to say, hey, you need to get your mind right about your money, then come back, and then we'll know what your path to financial independence and financial freedom looks like.
Right.
So I love that this is what you do. I think I could talk to you about this all day long. So Doug, so that we can wrap this up and people can go to the website and they can, by the way, while we were doing this, if you guys see me looking down and typing, it was because I was on Amazon. I not only ordered the book, but I ordered the Audible. So I have both those coming July 8th. I'm going to put that in my calendar so I remember. So because Amazon sometimes doesn't deliver things on time, I'm going to make sure that they do. So Doug, with this incredible background, and I can see why you were the top of your class because you're obviously very articulate and intelligent, is along this path, and we didn't really even get into the how did that happen, right? But which maybe we just need to have you come back and we'll go a totally different path.
Anytime. I'd be honored to come back.
But what's the best advice anybody's ever given you?
Well, it was a phrase that was repeated when I was in the Marines, and it's a Latin phrase from like Roman times, and I don't know who first said it, but my Latin sucks, so I'm going to pronounce it wrong. But the original Latin is "Aventus fortuna juvant," which translates to "Fortune favors the brave."
Yeah.
Right. And that has been a real mantra for me whenever I get scared, especially as a people pleaser or someone who's afraid to like step out. Like, fortune favors the brave. Take the risk. Get out. For me, for you, that wouldn't necessarily. You're easy. You like those sort of things. That's a little harder for me. So that's been a real guiding motto.
I love that. All right, last question. If God came down from heaven and only allowed you to retain the knowledge that you've received from one book, what would that book be?
Oh, that's a hard one. I'd have to pick one fiction and one nonfiction if I can.
You got it.
I would say for nonfiction, I would pick 12 Rules for Life by Jordan Peterson. That was really helpful for me in so many ways. I wish that I found that book, came out 30 years earlier. And then for fiction, I picked The Brothers Karamazov by Dostoevsky because it contains the whole human experience.
Really? Okay. Yeah. I've not ever read that. It's funny when you said that in the audience, I always we talk about this is the only really thing that I talk about before we start recording is Doug said, can I pick a nonfiction and a fiction? I said, of course. And you know what book that I would say is the book that I needed that knowledge that I would need to retain the knowledge of one book was Jonathan Livingston Seagull. Mm-hmm. And it was just basically because it said to me, even if I was born a seagull, I don't have to stay a seagull. I don't have to act like a seagull. So if I was born poor, that doesn't mean I have to stay poor. Doesn't mean I have to act like I'm poor. Can be, I can do the tricks and stuff that Jonathan Livingston Seagull wanted to do. Sometimes when you're in school and they say, you have to read this book. And I thought, why do I want to read this book? It's a dumb book. Yeah. But it impacted me 50 years later, like in a bigger way than I ever would have guessed as a kid. So the books that you mentioned, and it's funny, I would see you as a Jordan Peterson fan just because that's not a short book, by the way, right?
No.
So I look at that and I see a book like this and I go, gosh, how long is that going to take me to read? But I could see where I would need like the Cliff Notes version. I've read the book, by the way, but it was a struggle for me to get through it. So just because I love him. He's so opposite of me, right? And I love having business partners and people we do alliances with that are opposite of me, because I know I'm not everything, and I need that balance So anyway, I would, like I said, we could talk about, I think I could talk to you forever on this subject, and we definitely want to have you come back, and I want to hear like what molded this to get you where you're at. But I would encourage everybody in the audience is, if you didn't get something out of that little bit of coaching right there, then go back and listen to it again. But you got to go and just go to Doug's website, check out his stuff. I just ordered the book. So I'm taking action. Action cures everything, not only fear. And, Doug, thank you so much for being on the show today. And audience, we're going to wrap this up like we do every week. And that's with the incredible words of Earl Nightingale and The Strangest Secret. You are what you think about, and you are and will become what you think about. So thank you very much, Doug. Again, Doug, thank you.
Thanks, Jim. Appreciate it. Real honor to be here.
Thank you.
Here's the key to success and the key to failure. We become what we think about. Now let me say that again. We become what we think about.
Thanks for listening to the Breakaway Wealth Podcast. Be sure to subscribe to this show wherever you're listening so you never miss an episode. If you want to start increasing your wealth building ability right now, go to community.createtailwind.com to join our free online community and get access to free, in-depth training designed to help you build real, lasting wealth. See you next week.